Okay. We're delighted to have you join us for an incredible conversation this afternoon about a timely topic that may be new for some of you. And maybe you only think it's new, but it's really a conversation about topics that you're all familiar with and care about. So our topic today is ethnocide and dignity rights. And this program is sponsored by the American Bar Association Center for Human Rights and the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. We have two luminaries with us this afternoon, one in the person of Professor Erin Daly. And Professor Daly is a professor of law at the Delaware Law School. She's also the executive director of Dignity Rights International. She has served as an interim dean. She is a frequent and celebrated author on the topic of dignity rights. And she is one of the leading authors of the ABA resolution on dignity rights. Joining her on the panel is the Philosopher-In-Chief, Mr. Barrett Holmes Pitner. Barrett Pitner is the author of the book, The Crime Without a Name, Ethnocide and the Erasure of Culture in America. As I said, he is the founder and Philosopher-In-Chief of the Sustainable Culture Lab. He's a lecturer, an author, a critic, a visionary, a contributor, and he is the father of probably the world's cutest baby. And he is, both of them rather, are involved actively in the Dignity Rights Project, which is a project of the Center for Human Rights. Well, we're going to be talking, and I'm going to serve as a nominal moderator. I will just tell you that I am Judge Bernice Donald, a former chair of the Center for Human Rights. I am currently a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit and the chair of the Dignity Rights Project of the Center for Human Rights. And as I said, I'm going to serve as a nominal moderator, and I'm going to ask questions that I believe you would want to have answers to. But I also want to invite you to submit your own questions in the chat, and I will constantly monitor the chat. If they're talking about something that your question relates to, I will bring it to the fore. And certainly we'll try to leave about 10 minutes at the end or so for questions that you've not had an opportunity to type because you were so fascinated by the conversation. So let's get started. I want to first of all thank you, Erin, and you, Barrett, for being willing to engage in this conversation on these timely topics this afternoon. So I'm here currently at the Harvard Law School, and I was talking to a professor at the Harvard Law, and I told her that I was going to be involved in a conversation about dignity rights. Professor Daly, the first question she asked me is, what is dignity law, dignity rights, and how does that relate to the substantive and procedural law that we all grapple with and teach about day in and day out? So I want to ask you to answer a question in absentia and talk to us about this notion of dignity rights and dignity law.
Thank you so much, Judge Donald, and it's really such a pleasure to be here. So I'm delighted to share the space with Barrett and of course with you, Your Honor. It's a great question. So let me just start by sort of giving a little bit of an overview of what we mean when we're talking about dignity rights. Two words, right? Dignity and rights. So the first word, dignity. Dignity you can think of as the inherent human quality that gives each person equal worth. So it contains sort of several different aspects to it. One is just the notion of worth, the idea that every human life matters, no matter what. You can't dismiss or deny the value of a person's life. You can't treat someone as less than human. Sometimes we see in the case law and in constitutions where it'll say that people should be treated as a person. That connotes that there is some value to being a person, to having human life. And it makes certain practices like torture, for instance, impossible, unjustifiable. Second aspect of the notion of dignity is that it's universal. Now, this is actually a really, really radical idea in human history. Human history is is the whole history, as we'll talk about more when Barrett starts talking about his book and his work on ethnocide. But human history is the history of drawing class distinctions, drawing gender distinctions, of treating some people as less dignified than others. So one of the ways in which we think about dignity now is that it is universal. Every person has inherent worth. You don't have to be a dignitary to have it. Or in fact, the other way of thinking about it is that just by being human, we are all dignitaries. Another quality, inherent, meaning that it's not granted. This is not a right that's granted to you by the state, and depending on your relationship with the state, you may or may not have that right. We all have inherent human dignity. It's something we're born with. A fourth quality of dignity is that it has to exist in each person in equal measure. Nobody can have more dignity than someone else, because if you do, then of course you can justify all kinds of abuse or taking rights away from people, or humiliating them because they have less dignity than you. I think that this is actually the reason that the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights thought that dignity would be sort of an antidote or a response to the horrors of World War II. And then lastly, and connected to that, dignity is inalienable. It cannot be taken away. No matter what happens, your rights can be taken away, but your dignity can't be taken away. But it can be damaged or threatened or diminished. There's all kinds of words that people use to show, to sort of try to explain the feeling of not being in full measure of your dignity. And that's where the law comes in. So the second word when we talk about dignity rights is rights. And this is just simply the notion that there are certain rights that flow from the recognition of human dignity. And the law should, at the very least, have as its purpose the protection of human dignity, right? Some people will talk about dignity as being both the alpha and the omega of law. It's the source of law. It's also the purpose of law. And we see cases from around the world on dignity.
I want to interrupt you for just a moment and ask the question, because I hear people in the audience asking, isn't this more aspirational than actionable? Because is there a remedy necessarily for the denial of dignity? We know that in our founding documents, we talked about all persons being created equal, or all men being created equal. And we talk about inalienable rights, but the reality rather is that there are marked differences, and it seems like dignity, or at least the act of dignity, is not equal amongst classes and groups. So is this just aspirational, or is it something that really is actionable when there's a denial?
Well, it's both, right? The law is aspirational. We're using law always to try to make things better, to ensure that people can live in fuller freedoms. And one way of doing that is to ensure that the law remembers and recognizes the equal and inherent dignity of each person. So in fact, all over the world, including in the US, there are cases where dignity rights are being vindicated. Courts have said this practice, this way of treating prisoners violates human dignity, and therefore it is unjustified. This way of treating the environment violates human dignity, and therefore it must be fixed in order to protect the environment. So what we're seeing is a vast and growing jurisprudence of dignity, where courts are really taking this idea seriously and using it sort of as a measure of what a constitutional right ought to be. When we interpret the Eighth Amendment, the First Amendment, whatever it is, or some statutory law, we might interpret it in a way that protects human dignity.
Okay, so in an ordered and equal society, are there instances where people can engage in conduct that is such a gross departure from the norms that they are not deserving of this dignity?
So, people have different views about these things, but from what I've seen in studying the case law around the world, is that the idea of inalienability is really important. For instance, what courts will say, including in the US, is that if a person commits a crime, is sentenced to prison, they lose their liberty, but they never lose their dignity. So that criminal sentences, for instance, conditions in prisons, must be consistent with human dignity, that there's never any justification for trying to take dignity away from a person.
Not even in the case, and are you saying that not even in the case of an individual perhaps who commits a sexual crime against a child, there would not be a justification for depriving that individual of dignity?
Right. I mean, I think that's the challenge that dignity imposes on us. And when the American, you mentioned in your introduction, the American Bar Association's recent resolution from 2019, affirming that dignity rights are the foundation of a just rule of law. I think that's what it was getting at, was that no matter what, people's dignity has to be protected. You have all kinds of other recourses in the law, but not that.
And so saying that a person is still entitled to dignity doesn't mean that they should evade punishment. The laws prescribe punishments, and I'm getting some activity in the chat, and I just wanted to make clear for all of our listeners that saying that people should be accorded dignity is not saying that there should not be serious, just, and consequential punishment. And those punishments are defined by the laws and statutes, and those should be exacted. But you're talking about the fulsomeness of dignity.
Yeah, exactly. That the challenge that dignity poses is to say that no matter what, a person is still a person and should be treated as a person. And you take whatever measures society needs to take to deal with transgressions and wrongdoing and crimes. But the communities, including all of Europe, Latin America, most of the world, that is committed, at least in paper, to the protection of human dignity, to the recognition of human dignity. The idea is that you exact a punishment, but even so, the punishment has to be consistent with human dignity. That's why we don't torture people in prison.
Okay. I interrupted you when you were talking about the various countries around the world that have some expression of dignity in their laws. If you wanted to go back and finish that and then talk to us about how that is manifested, for example, in some of those constitutions and some of the countries maybe that have dignity in their laws that we might be surprised about.
So a couple of things about sort of where dignity appears in law. The short answer is everywhere. It appears at the international level in the foundational documents. The purpose of the United Nations itself in the Charter is first to end the scourge of war, but secondly, and relatedly, to reaffirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And a few years later, the drafters of the UDHR, led by Eleanor Roosevelt, issued a declaration, which was adopted by the General Assembly on December 10th, of course, that affirms the inherent dignity and equal rights of every person. So we get it from there. From there, at the international level, it shows up in most human rights instruments. It shows up in the regional human rights instruments in the Americas, in Europe, in Africa, and elsewhere. And then it shows up in the constitutions of more than, at our count, somewhere near 170 nations. So somewhere around 170 nations reflect dignity in their constitution. Now there's 194 nations in the UN. So this is really a very broad global consensus. And once it's in the constitutions, courts start paying attention. So we have a jurisprudence of literally thousands of cases on every topic you can think of that's of importance to the human experience, that respect and seek to reflect human dignity. I'll just give you one example. In the United States, the Supreme Court has said that the Eighth Amendment is about nothing less than the dignity of man. It's also said that the First Amendment rests on the dignity and choice of each person to be able to make a decision about what they want to say. So, and Obergefell most recently reflects dignity sort of at the confluence of the due process clauses and the equal protection clause. So we see it in a lot of different ways, including in our own law.
Okay, so I'm going to give you one of the questions from the chat that relates to this topic of conversation before I move to Barrett. Two questions, actually. What does the concept of dignity rights add to, quote, human rights? Is there an overlap? Is it an alternative or a supplement to human rights?
I would say it's part of human rights. It's intrinsic in the notion of human rights, and that's why I sort of mentioned in human rights instruments from the UDHR, the international covenants, the regional human rights, all of these documents, just like the ABA resolution, position dignity as both the source or the center and also the purpose of human rights law. So you can think of it as sort of, and people disagree. You can ask 10 dignity scholars about this. They'll all give slightly different answers. But I think overall, we're really all saying sort of the same kind of thing, which is that dignity is what gives human rights meaning. The reason we have human rights, the reason we have constitutional rights, the reason we have law is to protect what is inherently the inherent value of each human being. Mm-hmm. So it is, as one jurist in South Africa called it, the lodestar of human rights law or of constitutionalism. It is why we do this and what we're seeking to achieve in paying attention to human rights and constitutional rights.
Okay, and I'm going to paraphrase another question on the same topic. And the question relates to the legacy of systemic inequalities in the U.S. and its, quote, justice system. How does dignity rights in the race and social justice context help to address the barriers, racial and socioeconomic, that have remained sort of intransigent for the history of the country? How does dignity rights help or further address those issues?
I think that at a certain level, this is very, very simple, right? If we had a legal system that remembered and committed to the idea that every single human being has inherent and equal worth, we could eliminate much of the injustice that we have in our legal system, right? And at a slightly sort of more complex or sophisticated level, one of the things that we're all doing in this dignity rights work is developing a vocabulary to talk about these issues, to understand that what dignity entitles people to is a certain amount of agency over their lives, is protection against humiliation, protection against discrimination. It's protection for bodily integrity. It's an ability to dignity rights entitle a person to belong to a social community and also, really importantly, to a political community and exercise democratic rights. So part of what we're doing is sort of looking at the cases, again, in the US and abroad, that have developed this idea of dignity in the applied circumstances of a case, and sought to understand, start to develop a more sophisticated and nuanced vocabulary for what dignity rights really entails. And I think we'll talk more about this, because I think one of the concerns that Barrett will talk about is what happens when we have the absence of that vocabulary.
Absolutely. So Barrett, Pitner, you have written extensively and provocatively and spoken about this term, ethnocide. And that's another term that will be unfamiliar to many of us on the Zoom today. I want to welcome you and invite you to talk a little bit about how do you define ethnocide, and then what motivated you to write the book about ethnocide and the erasure of culture.
Yeah, thanks for bringing me in. So just to give people like a quick definition of ethnocide, ethnocide is the erasure of a people's culture while keeping the people. And so this term was first coined in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin. Raphael Lemkin was a Jewish Polish refugee. He fled Europe during World War II. And when he came to the United States, he was like a prominent lawyer in Europe. So he was trying to talk to, government officials and other lawyers in the US about what was happening to his people. And he felt that his message wasn't really resonating or getting through. And he concluded that was because there wasn't a precise word to describe this new type of destruction that was happening in Europe. So Lemkin coined the word genocide to describe what was happening to his people. But when he coined the word genocide, he also coined the word ethnocide. And it's literally in the footnotes. The ethnocide was intended to be an alternative to genocide because Jewish people were a genos, a people, but they're also a nation or culture, an ethnos of people. And so ethnocide kind of like remained in the footnotes for decades. And around the 70s, people started using it in relation to indigenous people in the Americas, where their culture was being destroyed, but they remained. And in my book, The Crime Without a Name, Ethnocide and the Erasure of Culture in America, I use that term to describe the transatlantic slave trade, because the explicit goal of that was to get African people and forcefully remove African culture from them so that America could have a mass of Black people to remake the landscape and to enrich colonizers. And so if you think about the United States and this foundational aspect of it, and there's not a clear word that we're familiar with to describe like a social construct, a type of systemic destruction that has been here from the beginning, it shows an inadequacy of articulating the world in which we live. And this lack of language is going to impede our capacity to make adequate laws and to even discuss the structures that create our racial differences and the systemic problems throughout the society. And so, one of the reasons that Erin and I can collaborate and I'm able to participate at the ABA is that an ethnocidal way of life where you are destroying the culture of another person for your financial benefit is an undignified way to try to live. And so you need to be able to counter that by having a philosophy, a narrative of what dignity is and what a dignified life would be, and how would you address people that have done something wrong in a dignified way, so even that our prisoners are dignified, and that we can have this philosophy, this practice, and use that to shape our laws in society.
So Barrett, how do you distinguish ethnocide from genocide? And I also want you to talk a little bit about, you talked about the Atlantic slave trade, transatlantic slave trade as being, I guess, one of the biggest examples of ethnocide. If we define it that way, are we talking about ethnocide as something that is confined to a time, or is this something that in the United States that has moved forward? I mean, that is still identifiable, observable, and that is needs in need of redress?
Yeah, great question. So, the key distinction between ethnocide and genocide is like the type of terror that's inflicted upon each community can be very similar, but the key distinction is the end goal. So for genocide, the end goal is for the people inflicting genocide on the other group of people to live in a space in the absence of those people, where you're either exterminating them or forcibly removing them, and you're living in land that used to be their land and they're gone, and now you are starting anew in their absence. Genocide, if you look at how Lemkin used it regarding the Germans had this whole terminology of Lebensraum, where they wanted room to live, and to do that, they wanted to get rid of Jewish people and Eastern European Slavs so they could live in a Germanic place in the absence of these people. Ethnocide, there's not an agenda to live in the absence of the people. It's to live with the people in your society, but to have them be perpetually oppressed. And then you will cultivate an entire narrative where that oppression is just articulated as normal and natural and it's going to happen forever. And so like ethnocide is not something that just happened at the transatlantic slave trade and then ended. You know, like the transatlantic slave trade was the extraction of that culture. And next thing you know, these African people were not referred to by even their African identifiers. They became referred to by the color of their skin and not the culture that they had cultivated for hundreds and thousands of years in Africa. And then you have chattel slavery, then you have Jim Crow, and there's a whole array of oppressive structures that are just the American norm that all derive from this normalization of extracting and consuming people's culture to keep like our society divided and oppressed.
Okay, so I want to kind of push back on that just a little bit and ask the following question. Because it sounds like when we talk about ethnocide, that it has to be an intentional act. Side means, killing, it's homicide, whatever kind of a thing. But the American experiment talks about a great melting pot where we leave behind, I guess, certain things that all come to be, one culture, the American exceptional culture, which to me does not connote necessarily an intentional oppressive act. How does this notion of ethnocide either reconcile with this notion of the great American experiment of some cultural melting pot?
Yeah, so I'd say one thing that America does that's so peculiar, and I'm not surprised by it, but we like to put too much weight on people's intent. Like if I'm going to do something and someone's only capable of judging whether that's good or bad, whether they can conclude that I had malicious intent, when that's going to let me get away with absolutely anything. We're not going to have a conversation about the impact on people's lives. We're going to have a conversation about how I perceive somebody's intent or the intent that they tell me. And there's clearly no guarantee that that's going to be truthful or accurate. So we have to like break away from the focus on intent to even be able to have like a legitimate conversation. And so then once we start talking about the American experiment of a melting pot, when things melt together, what that culture, what that group of people does is they create a new word to describe that new thing that was created due to the melting. And America proclaims to be a melting pot, but we never proclaim what's that new culture that has harmoniously brought people together and what's that even called. Like you can go to like other parts of Latin America and they have like national identifiers, but there's also cultural identifiers that's indicative of the melting of cultures, but whether that's like indigenous and Spanish or whatever, that's a new word that's been created. And America just doesn't have that. So we like to say that we're a melting pot while actually doing everything to prevent that melting and have never named what the product of that melting is. So it's just a facade that makes us feel good as we don't actually like accomplish the goal.
So there's a question. So ethnocide and genocide are equally applicable to indigenous communities today. That's directed to you, Barrett.
Yeah, 100%. Like indigenous communities have definitely, genocide was definitely inflicted upon them. There's no ambiguity for that. Like I'm from Georgia and the Trail of Tears happened like the county next to me. Like I'm from Cobb County and Cherokee County is north of me and there aren't Cherokees living there, So genocide without a doubt. I think once we start using the language of like the schooling systems, and Canada had theirs was quite prevalent up until like the 1990s, but the schooling systems where they're trying to extract or eradicate indigenous culture to make them more of like an industrialized, westernized person is definitely an agenda of ethnocide. And one of the reasons why I focus on the transatlantic slave trade just as like an initial foray is it's easy to show that is like a distinctly ethnocidal agenda where there's not like a blurring of the lines where like it could be genocide or it could be ethnocide. Like this is uniquely ethnocide. Where for indigenous people, there's clearly like a mixture of the two that's been existing for the beginning of colonization. So both terms are definitely applicable to the various types of oppression that indigenous people have faced and continue to face in the present.
Okay, so Barrett, there's one other question directed to you, and then I'm going to bring Erin back in. So this question says, Barrett, could you speak to the relationship between ethnocide and quote, social cleansing, end quote. I've seen that term used to describe targeting of marginalized populations in Latin America, often with the backing of the US.
So I will say that with regards to the term social cleansing, I'm not sure if I'm as familiar with the term as the questioner, but the idea that cleansing yourself of your own culture is then somehow indicative of progress is without a doubt ethnocidal, because culture is what people cultivate to survive in the place in which they live. So like a culture in one place is not going to be inherently superior or inferior to another place, because the requirements, the things you're going to have to cultivate are going to be different. And as we move throughout the world, our cultures are going to change. And, like as America gets more diverse and there's more interracial marriages, that means people's cultures are going to change, because now that next generation is going to have like a sharing of culture where they're not trying to cleanse either. They're just trying to make sure there's a harmonious mixing of what they have to make something that transcends and elevates and grows.
Okay, so Erin, bringing you back in, you have made the statement that dignity is the antidote to ethnocide. What do you mean by that?
I think in a couple of different ways. I think historically what I was referring to was the fact that dignity dignity has been a part of philosophy, and to some extent it's been a part of law. It was in a few constitutions, a handful of constitutions before the Second World War, but it really sort of landed very firmly in our law in 1945, as I mentioned, when the United Nations Charter was written, and then especially in 1948 when the UDHR was written. And they were very much responding to, they were creating a new world order in which Nazism couldn't happen, in which the Holocaust couldn't happen. They were very much responding to that. They were survivors of that world. And there's we have very little like legislative history about how the word dignity came to have such a prominent place in the UDHR, and very little how it came to have a prominent place in the American Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted about 6 months before the UDHR. So a lot of this is sort of supposition based on just what people said, and people have done research on this. But the idea is that recognizing the inherent and equal worth of every person, really truly recognizing that human worth, what binds us all together, that is what will stop us from treating us as other. Much of what Barrett is talking about, the idea of ethnocide is sort of the ultimate culmination of what happens when you treat someone as other and then as less than. And it devolves into genocide and ethnocide. And so dignity rights and the idea of dignity is sort of this reminder that we're not all different. We all have this common core of human worth. And at the level of humanity, and as the UDHR says, because we're all endowed with reason and conscience, we all have this inherent human worth. So I think historically they took it to be an antidote or a response to Nazism, and we can continue to apply it in all the different ways that Barrett talks about ethnocide. I think we can see dignity as sort of the inverse of what he's talking about, or ethnocide is the inverse of dignity.
There are a couple of interesting questions that have come in the chat, but I'm going to hold up on those because I want to now go into some of the areas of the substantive law and actually some policy and current terms that we all are familiar with, and ask you how these concepts of dignity rights and ethnocide apply, if at all, or whether we can find examples in some of these things or how they even play out. And I want to start with you first, Barrett. When we talk about ethnocide, when we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, and I know that is a controversial phrase for many people, but how, if at all, does ethnocide manifest or relate to that?
Yeah, great question. So, if you look at ethnocide from the very beginning, from the transatlantic slave trade, you can see that, colonizers, and this continued into the formation of the United States, there wasn't a foundation of respecting and even recognizing the dignity of African Black people. And so when you have a society that normalizes the othering of a whole mass of people, and where their lives appear to matter less in a humane way, clearly for the extraction and cultivating of wealth for people outside the Black community, the African people were very valuable in America, but not valuable in a dignified, humane way. And so this norm creates a whole society, a whole language that finds countless excuses to view Black people as dangerous or undeserving of adequate protection or education, or the police, are going to be more inclined to view them as threats. And when all of these norms, whether that's like these norms are linguistic or, within our head, manifest and have lethal outcomes, that we can see these outcomes. And they've always been there, whether it was lynching during Jim Crow, the killings during the civil rights movement. Now, since there's the access of phones, we actually get so many recordings of the type of terror that has just long been the American norm. And so once the awareness of the norm grows, there's going to be a movement that's trying to articulate that this is problematic. And I think it's quite prescient that the movement itself, the key phrase is that our lives matter, and it's not matter more than somebody else's lives. It's like, we just need to make sure we have a society where there's no denying or no questioning that these lives matter as much as all the other lives. That's a very dignified request. And it's a dignified request that exists to counter the ethnocidal norm. And so clearly, like, when people have a rebuttal and they say something like all lives matter or whatever, like, they're not saying all lives matter because they believe that Black lives matter equally. They're trying to negate the narrative at all. They're trying to, again, erase the voices of Black people by coming up with a meaningless phrase. And so you can see how much of like the language and the norm is about erasing Black existence and saying and silencing people that just want to exist equitably in dignity. And so it's pretty clear how it is. And you can see, as hate against Asian Americans is growing, and other like communities of color in the US are recognizing that they are being harmed unjustly in an undignified way, they're echoing similar statements where we don't matter more than other people. This isn't a competition. This isn't a perpetuating of othering. We are just trying to exist equitably in a universal, dignified way, and that's our demand. And it's really, really troubling when you acknowledge how controversial that idea is in America. And that's why it's so important that we can have the language, because I'm a philosopher, I'm not a lawyer, where everyday people can use the language of wanting to combat ethnocide and the other words that I use in the book, but we also have the language of dignity rights with Erin, so that our lawyers can start having a new philosophy and language to start making rights that ensure that the dignity of all the people in America is actually represented and not just imagined that it is.
So, Erin, the same question to you. What does dignity rights say about this phrase Black Lives Matter, and how do you respond to Barrett's comments?
Well, I'd respond to Barrett's comments by saying, yes, absolutely, everything he said. The point of the word matter is exactly that, right? That all human beings matter. That's all the dignity, sort of the dignity imperative, if you will.
So that's an expression of dignity, that lives matter.
I think it's so interesting that that's the name of the movement. It's just this recognition that these lives matter. And I agree with everything that Barrett said. I mean, his analysis of sort of why it's important to say that, and it's in no way a negation of saying that other lives don't, or anything like that, but just to recognize that they do. The other thing I would just mention from a dignity perspective about the Black Lives Matter movement or movements is that insofar as it sort of emanated from this, concern, to say the least, anger about police brutality, but also a lot of people involved in various aspects of the movement didn't limit the discourse to just that, right? And as COVID goes on, it had to do with health disparities, and it has to do with other disparities that we see. And each one of those is a dignity issue, right? I mean, so it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that dignity does is it invites us to sort of see the connection among different aspects of our being and the different things that are important to us, to have good healthcare, to have housing, to have adequate food and a healthy environment and all these things. And dignity sort of unites all these things together because they're all important to people. And you can see that also in the discourse of Black Lives Matter, concerned about very specific things like police brutality, but then also recognizing that these issues of, as Barrett would say, of ethnocide really pervade every aspect of the experience in the United States.
Okay, let's go to another topic of current conversation. Gun rights. What does dignity law have to say about that, if anything, Erin? And then I'll go to Barrett and ask the same question with respect to ethnocide.
I've read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases about dignity rights from around the world, and I've never seen one about the right to bear arms. So that's all I'll say. I'll say that jurisprudence is not yet well developed, but we'll see.
Okay, so Barrett, is there anything about the whole notion of gun laws and the whole gun policy dialogue and movement that expresses itself with respect to ethnocide?
Yeah, it's, this is more of a philosophical perspective, because as Erin points out, there's not, much legal scholarship where like people are saying that the dignified thing a society should have is everyone should have guns with no regulation. And so it's a philosophical exploration. But if you have a society that's ethnocidal, and say there's the South, and there are states in the South, and many of these states, about 40 to 30%, some even close to 50%, are enslaved. If you create an amendment, if you have an amendment in the Constitution, and it makes it so that you encourage people like militias to have guns to protect themselves from an invading army, it's going to be highly likely that people in the South that have to use their guns to oppress about half of their population will have a different interpretation of the necessity for guns to be in their society. Like, that's just naturally going to evolve. And if you discuss the South and you erase the experiences of Black people and how they're terrorized via guns every day, you're going to then cultivate a narrative that this area where people had guns, not necessarily as militias, but sometimes as militias, but as individuals, and they had duels and stuff, that made that society safer. And they're going to say it was safer because it prevented the Black people from existing and living in a dignified way. And if you can create a canon of like legal scholarship articulating, such as like in Nunn v. Georgia, that allowing people to open carry guns made the South safer, and ignore the fact that at that time, a lot of those guns are used to oppress about 30 to 40% of the population, you'll then have Supreme Court justices using Nunn v. Georgia 100 years plus in the future to say that this is why cities like Chicago and Washington, D.C. shouldn't have limitations on gun rights. And so in a really dystopian, almost Orwellian way, the implement that was explicitly used to terrorize Black people in the South during slavery is now being articulated as a necessary tool for freedom. And so now freedom and terror are just interwoven. And so now we wake up in the present, and people in America have these guns, and they're going around terrorizing people all the time. And our society feels completely incapable of articulating that removing these guns could make people's lives better, because we've been entranced by the idea that the prevalence of guns is an extension of freedom, regardless of whether they terrorize people all the time. The outcome is irrelevant. The theory that they make you free is all relevant, and will conceal the truth or how it impacts people of color to keep and maintain this propagated narrative. And that's really where we are. And that's how ethnocide's allowed to thrive, by kind of doing very much Orwellian doublethink and erasing the voices of people who are being oppressed. And that's just what happens. And so, that's why you'll have people whose job is to pass legislation. They'll see people get murdered senselessly with guns, and they'll say thoughts and prayers. Like they don't have the power to do anything, even though their job is to do something.
Okay.
It's clearly just dystopian.
All right, I want to go to another area, but I want to also acknowledge a couple of questions or comments that have come up in the chat. One of them I'm going to ask you to keep in your mind as a framework for for the questions that you're going to address. And the question is, how do you know what others, how do you know what, quote, others means? Isn't generalizations and assumptions part of the problem? So just hold that as your background. And the next question is, Barrett, so with some states currently passing legislation about CRT being taught in the schools, or the banning of certain books, the 1619 Project, or selective African American history topics, 21st century versions of an ethnocidal agenda, are those things manifestations of an ethnocidal agenda?
100%, because what they're trying to do is teach a narrative of America that's completely erased the experiences of the people of color who were brought here to not have the culture that they created in Africa, and to not even be able to accumulate the wealth or cultivate the culture where they could live, equally. So, you could look at, we talk about the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre. That's quite, we're more aware of that now. Like the only reason that massacre happened, and it took place in just 2 days, was because the Black community was prosperous enough to no longer live as dependents, and that the whites' neighbors they didn't feel that they could oppress them in perpetuity. So they then had to become, terrorists and destroy that community. So there is clearly an American narrative where the stories of Black people can't coincide with the peaceful narrative that America likes to project of itself. And one thing that's like really fascinating is like the feeling that like a lot of white people articulate regarding CRT is that if white children learn about their actual history, they'll feel bad, and we don't want white people to feel bad about reality, where like existence is a threat to their self-esteem, which is a whole nother level of just tragic. But it also speaks that they also don't feel that they have agency to become better people with knowledge. The status quo is that they just need to exist as bad people, and we just cater everything to remove the stuff that makes existence actually real. And that's how we teach people. And so that's without a doubt ethnocidal, because it exists to erase a whole group of people's culture, their narrative, their stories, for the emotional and sometimes even financial benefit of another group of people. And clearly it's, when we're talking about the South, it's Black stories going away for the emotional security of lots of white children.
Okay, and before I go to Erin, I want to stay with you for just a moment, Barrett, and you mentioned briefly the stories or the history of Native Americans or American Indians in this country. And, today when we talk about these major issues, oftentimes for that community or those communities, there's a whole issue of invisibility. Is that invisibility also expressed in ethnocidal terms? What can you say about Native Americans and the ethnocidal issues that might relate to that?
Yeah, no, that's definitely ethnocide. And one thing that's important when you think about ethnocide is it's not something that's just applied in one specific way to like one community of people. It's a philosophy of arbitrarily creating an other, and upon creating that other, feeling entitled to exploit that person, that other, and destroy their culture for some sort of imagined monetary gain, status, who knows. And so when it comes to indigenous people, like America without, and Canada too, they were unapologetic about the quote unquote Indian problem, where the original idea was to just completely eradicate indigenous people from the continent. And upon realizing that was not 100% feasible, part of it was just to make them exist almost as if they don't exist within their own land. And this is, the indigeneity and the connection to the land and the appreciation for the land is something that's really important for the sustainability of any society. And so without a doubt, the erasure of indigenous culture and America encouraging to create a society where they are like invisible people within their own land is without a doubt ethnocide. And the goal for that is to create a perpetually oppressed segment of the population, and people just normalize and think that that's just naturally how things are supposed to be. And it's because we have an undignified philosophy with regards to relating to human life. And that's why we have to have big ideas and a desire to incorporate dignity, just not in the language that we speak to one another, but also in the laws that we create.
Okay. There are two questions for you, Erin, and I'm going to read both of them, and you just address them as fulsomely as you care to. The first question is, on the note of education, can dignity rights theoretically or actually defend inclusion of authentic American history in primary and secondary education? And then the second question is, can you speak a little more about dignity rights and how it relates to poverty? How does the philosophy framework of dignity apply to ending poverty and also to increasing, making certain that we have less disparity in educational outcomes in schools across the country?
Those are really complex. I mean, at a certain level, those are complex policy problems, right? Problems that we, for reasons that Barrett has sort of explained, that we just haven't figured out the answer to yet. I think that the answer to both of them from a dignity standpoint is absolutely yes. Yes, of course, dignity can not only defend, but mandates the inclusion of multiple perspectives, mandates the inclusion of when we say that dignity relates to the worth of the human person, to the fact that people matter, it's a way of saying that we should create a society and have laws that reflect these values, including the values of what matters to those people, including, as Barrett was just talking about, sort of their narratives, their stories, their reality. If we develop an educational system that says this group's reality matters, but that group's reality, well, we're not going to listen to it. And in fact, it can get you in real trouble if you acknowledge it. We're obviously doing some serious violence to the dignity of those people whose stories would be told, but also of everybody's dignity, because it just diminishes the learning experience for everyone for reasons that, in ways that Barrett was describing. So from a dignity standpoint, you would need to create an educational system in which, as a curricular matter, in terms of like the content of education, everybody is listening to each other's stories because every person matters, right? And you want to make sure that you're going to have dominant narratives, and then you have to make sure that the non-dominant narratives also have space so that you can hear all the stories and they can sort of enrich each other. So I think from a curricular standpoint, dignity has a very strong mandate in terms of how we define what we are teaching in schools, all the way up through university, and in fact through law school and graduate schools. Related to that, how we fund education, how we choose to fund education is decidedly in a way that does not respect the dignity of every person's interest in gaining an equal and quality education. The Supreme Court long ago decided that there was no fundamental right to education, and there is no seriously protected fundamental right to have equal educational resources and opportunities. That's a real shame, and it does real violence to the notion of individual dignity. Somebody noted in the chat, I think Greg noted in the chat about FDR, and the four freedoms. They're both they're material as well as not material, right? Freedom from fear, but also freedom from want. He recognized that, as did his wife Eleanor in the UDHR. So it shouldn't be sort of news to anybody, and certainly not to people who think about the law, to say that these rights are interconnected, that if you don't have a roof over your head or you're unhealthy and you can't get health care, that it's going to be much harder to engage in education, to engage in employment, to engage in voting, to engage in other things we do as part of the community. So we know from an experiential matter, everybody knows that these things are interconnected within us, and the law needs to sort of reflect that interdependence. I guess I'll just say one other thing about it, just from a legal perspective. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 comes out with this catalog of 30 rights, of which dignity is the first. And after that, the effort to create a binding Bill of Rights sort of fractures, so that there becomes then the catalog in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights on the one hand, and then separately a catalog of economic, social, and cultural rights on the other hand. That's really unfortunate. That's just an unfortunate sort of fact of history. And so it wasn't until after the Cold War, after the wall came down, that the country started to seriously sort of adopt both, recognizing that having one catalog of rights without the other really doesn't get you very far. It doesn't protect your dignity.
Let me add something
Barrett,
onto that real quick.
Please.
So I think one thing that's important as we're talking about like various policies and initiatives that could, how dignity could impact like combating homelessness or improving education, is that we're talking about like kind of like a three-tiered process where you have to have like a philosophy at the beginning that is a philosophy recognizing like the shared dignity. So like if we get out of like European philosophy and go to like African, there's this African proverb that's called Ubuntu, which means I am because we are. This philosophy clearly is one that denotes human dignity, where I'm a person because we are people and I can see your humanity, you can see my humanity. And so if I have this core philosophy, I'm then going to cultivate language that is just like the regular, everyday layperson manifestation of that philosophy. And that language will also eventually manifest into laws so that we protect it, because it's going to be, people are going to do something that's going to not respect our shared humanity. They'll have an idea like, I think, therefore I am, instead of I am because we are. And that philosophy could result in them doing something undignified. Well, let's make laws that we still treat that person in a dignified way and try to like help them see the benefit of this philosophical vision of respecting the shared humanity of everybody. And once you have that philosophy and the language first, then you're going to be really empowered to cultivate the laws that can combat all sorts of problems. And so like my work regarding ethnocide is giving the language for people to see the problem. And then once you can see the problem, then there's more words that you can create to articulate the various problems, but also the solutions. And dignity rights and dignity law as part of the language. And clearly, I didn't come up with dignity rights, dignity law. I'm not trying to take any claim of that, but that's part of the language that you can use to create the solutions once you have a philosophy that's not ethnocidal and one that is about respecting our shared human dignity.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about these concepts as it relates to the whole voter movement. And I want to start by saying that getting access to the franchise has been a huge issue in this country. for a very long time. And we all know stories of denial of dignity as people sought the basic franchise in my own community. And I'm in Shelby County, Tennessee now, but there was in the 50s when African Americans were seeking the right to vote and really getting out, demanding the right to vote, when people who were sharecroppers were en masse put off the land. People were denied participation in commerce. I mean, they were not permitted to buy food at white-owned grocery stores. They were not permitted to buy fuel from the fuel suppliers in the community. Those who had jobs were fired. They actually they were put off of the lands on which they were living because they were seeking the right to vote. And people who are interested in this can go on the internet and look up the tent city, which was in Fayette County, Tennessee. There were just hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people who were forced to live for, I think, a couple of years on tents with dirt floors. Babies were born in those conditions. They lived there winter and summer because they simply sought the American franchise. Well, those kind of things are not going on today, but I think that voting issues are still bound up in these issues of dignity law. And Barrett, you may say that there are ethnocidal issues in there. I don't know, but I really want you all to comment on how, if at all, you see these things manifested in the current voting issues. And I will ask you then, is sort of the move to artificial intelligence and technology going to remedy all of this? So Barrett, you're shaking your head, and so I want you to start.
So yes, ethnocide is pervasive in all of these current obstacles we're facing. And if you just look at it from the founding of the country, where, Virginia and Pennsylvania had about the same amount of eligible white male voters at the founding of the nation. But Virginia dominated American politics because Virginia had a larger enslaved population. So the 3/5 compromise ended up giving the oppressors more representation nationally. And so now they set a tone where a whole part of the country is supposed to have a disproportionate amount of influence in shaping how America works because they are preventing people from voting. And so now, as America tries to be equitable and make sure that more and more people have the franchise, the parts of America, especially the South, but other parts that agree with that ideology from the South, view an equitable expansion of the franchise as a great threat to the status quo. And so that's one key, so if you look at it from a very basic level, we have a standard of democracy that is almost contingent and expects a large swath of the population to not vote for the benefit of another group of people. And so that's why there's so many obstacles regarding voting in a lot of these places, because it would create a radical power shift, and one group of people, one political party or two political parties wouldn't be able to thrive at the expense of a segment of Americans not being able to vote. And so it's definitely ethnocidal. I will say, and this is fascinating, probably like 5 years ago, I wrote a column for the Daily Beast about enfranchisement. And my editors thought it was a radical idea because I just proposed that everybody, like people incarcerated, people in prison, should be able to vote. And they were just like, what is this? Like anybody can vote because they're all people. They, this helps them stay connected to the world. And these people that are in prison, lots of them, they have families. They're going to want to be able to make decisions while in prison that would benefit their family members, because at some point, they're going to leave prison too. And so to allow them to be active citizens and giving them dignity, making sure that they keep up with the news and all that kind of stuff is essential. And once you start having that conversation, the whole notion of like felon enfranchisement becomes moot, because if you're letting people who have felonies that are in jail, and many of them will never leave jail, you let them vote, letting people who are out of jail and have felonies and preventing them from voting would just be so absurd. And so when I was telling my editors about this, they thought it was a crazy idea. And then I pointed out that Vermont's state constitution allows all people incarcerated in state prisons to vote. And that's been like that from the beginning. And so these ideas regarding dignity that a lot of people think are outlandish or crazy or possible, if you just do a little bit of digging, you'll see that places in America and places around the world have been doing these radical ideas for so long. And America just has normalized this like low standard regarding democracy that we don't even imagine that the possible and currently occurring is possible. And that's clearly part of like an ethnocidal way of looking at it, when you don't think respecting another person's humanity is a thing that's even possible, that you could create legislation to do. That's wild.
Erin?
Yeah.
How's dignity implicated?
It's implicated a lot. So just to give a couple more examples from what Barrett was talking about, there are a number of countries, Australia is one of them, that has compulsory voting, right? So there's nothing that radical about the idea that saying if you're an adult, you should participate in the democracy and you should vote. And that obviously in some ways transforms the whole political discourse if you know that the entire polity has access to the polls. And the decision, I think Barrett's absolutely right in sort of calling out the United States on this and pointing out that there is nothing natural about this. It is sort of a part of our history, but it's a choice that we make and that we every day continue to make to disenfranchise growing numbers of sort of populations of people. So a couple of thoughts about it sort of from the pure dignity perspective. One is, Hannah Arendt wrote not very much about dignity, but what she wrote was really, really profound. And one of the things that she wrote in the 1950s about this, again, against the backdrop of World War II and of statelessness and a lot of these kinds of, refugee issues, a lot of the issues that we're dealing with today, what she wrote is that dignity is simply the right to have rights. That dignity is what gives us the right to wake up in the morning and say, I'm entitled to more. Whether it's as against somebody else, a friend or, somebody else, or whether it's against, the public power. That dignity is the right to have rights. And I think that's such an important way of understanding the work that dignity does, the fuel that it gives to democracy, really. And that the whole basis of democracy, government by the people, is that the people matter. And the more you want your democracy to be fair, the more you're going to be inclusive and the more you're going to weight each person's mattering equally. So there's a number of courts that have written about what they've called civic dignity. The South African Constitutional Court, which is very much a leader in this area, has written about the notion of civic dignity, specifically in the context that Barrett talks about, why people who are in prison, let alone having served their terms, should be entitled to vote, and that there's really no excuse for drawing that line and saying, well, because you've committed a crime, you shouldn't be allowed to vote. It goes back to what we were talking about before. Because you committed a crime, you're sentenced to a certain punishment, a certain time incarceration, or whatever it is. But that doesn't mean that you have additional indignities added on to that. And the withholding of the franchise is an additional indignity. So there are, as I say, there are a lot of decisions from around the world that follow this notion that an intrinsic part of dignity is the right to belong to a community, very much imagined in the way that Barrett was talking about Ubuntu. Another formulation of that is that I am who I am through other people. It starts out sounding very individualistic, I am who I am, but then your identity is just bound up in other people. So this notion of the dignity of belonging to a community, and if you combine that with the idea of agency, that we get to control something about our lives, that's part of dignity also, then we have the right to engage in decision-making on a community basis.
Okay.
One thing, we just add one thing real quick.
Ahead.
is when the Vermont law that allows people in state prisons to vote. The one exception to prevent you from voting is if you're convicted of voter fraud.
Right.
And so
right.
and so the people that are trying to undermine this dignified process, that is what ends up getting their access to it taken away. And I think it's fascinating if you look at all of the accusations of voter fraud throughout the U.S., where I believe there's a woman in Texas a couple of years ago that they found her, she voted when she wasn't registered to vote, and they sent her to jail. And there are a lot of white Americans who are getting convicted of voter fraud, and they're getting like fines and time served. And so even when it comes to preserving the dignity of our democracy and our voting process, we don't even treat people fairly whether they intentionally or unintentionally broke the law. And that's another example of just how our ethnocidal, undignified way will corrupt a dignified practice such as voting in democracy.
I'm just going to read a comment from the chat. It says, from Fannie Lou Hamer to Barbara Jordan to Barbara Arnwine, the voting franchise has been used as a tool to keep and control power. Also, students are fearful to both parties because they have a history of instigating change. Thus, impediments to their voting can find support in both parties. And I'll make another comment. In Shelby County, my home community, there's a case that's going on now where a woman, an African-American woman who had done time, was basically told by her probation officer, and I think given paper, that she was now eligible to, to get an application to vote. And she sought to do that, didn't actually cast a vote, but just sought to register to vote. And she has been convicted and is serving 6 years. And that's, I think, Pamela Moses. But Barrett, every night, yeah, you can comment on that, but let me get this other question out there, because I want you to make your comment about voting, and then I want you to go to this, because every night we turn on our TVs, we are bombarded with images from Ukraine and news about that. And I wanted you to sort of speak to that a little bit through your ethnocidal lens, and just talk to the audience about what you have them see from an ethnocidal standpoint, and what lessons you draw from there. But talk about the voting first, and then go to Ukraine.
Yeah, I'll go real quick on voting. Just the other day, two elderly retirees in this community called the Villages in Florida were found guilty of voting more than once for Donald Trump in the 2020 election. And the judge just sentenced them, I think, to 50 hours of community service. And so when you see, when a Black person is told by an authority figure that they have the right to vote, they then attempt to just get the paperwork to do so, America is inclined to put them in jail for 6 years. And when a white person votes more than once knowingly, it's like community service, they learn their lesson. These disparities are just so undignified, and we need to have the language to precisely articulate what this problem is, and how this consistently seems to happen. And when you don't have that precision of language, it makes it hard to properly adjudicate and even discuss the severity of the problem. And so to go to Ukraine, this is interesting. In my book, The Crown Without a Name, I have a whole chapter dedicated to this kind of interesting Ukrainian Russian word that I think articulates a lot of the inequalities of America and also Russian society. I won't spend much time talking about that word because it'll go on a tangent, but get my book and you'll learn all about it. But when it comes to Ukraine, you can see that Putin's narrative for why he could invade or should invade Ukraine was a narrative that Ukrainian people just didn't have culture, that they were just a group of people who were a derivative of Russia. And, the fact that these people who have a culture felt that they could join the European Union or NATO or do things on their own volition with their own agency to get closer to Western Europe was a profound threat to him, because in his mind, they're a cultureless mass of people who are just derivatives of Russia. Therefore, he needs to go in there and take over that place, because in his mind, it's still his place. And this is the agenda wasn't to have a Ukraine in the complete absence of Ukrainian people, where Russians come in and repopulate it. It was to have Ukraine as a place where Ukrainians become Russian, because that's what they really are in his mind, and not Ukrainian. And this is clearly an ethnocidal agenda. The end goal isn't the complete erasure of all Ukrainian people. It's the making of Ukrainians into Russian. And he's been quite vocal in that, because his argument from the beginning was that Ukrainians were just Russians, and they shouldn't even imagine that they could be Ukrainians, because that's not a thing that exists in his mind. That's a whole agenda based on the erasing of the culture of an entire people. And that erasure of that culture he used as a justification to go in and take what he said is his, and that's just ethnocidal. And so we're using the language of genocide to describe it. And that's because we're seeing the atrocities and terror that's being inflicted upon the people. But I think the term ethnocide, may be a more apt indicator, because I don't believe he wants to have a Ukraine completely devoid of Ukrainians that's repopulated with Russians. It's to indoctrinate Ukrainians into being Russian and take their culture away and use them as essentially like oppressed people that's like a Russian colony.
Okay. So, Erin, I don't want to foreclose giving you an opportunity to talk about that if you want to, but if there's anything you want to say, I'm going to give you my final two questions, and I'm going to ask them seriatim. So the first one for both of you, and I'll start with Erin, is this conversation this afternoon just an interesting academic, philosophical conversation, or is there something that the audience, lawyers, judges can and should do? And if so, what is that thing that you would have us do as a result of this conversation that we're having? And Erin, I'm gonna start with you. Are we just having a nice Thursday afternoon conversation?
Well, I think we are doing that. And I hope everyone's enjoying it. But I also think there is a purpose to this. There is, I think both Barrett and I, if I can just speak for you for just a second, but we're both sort of motivated by a desire to encourage people to see things in a different way and then act upon it, right? So from my perspective, from the legal perspective, I think it's really important to understand, not just as a philosophical matter, that every person has human worth, but that the law already does and should more respect that human worth. There's a lot of ways, and Barrett has been just absolutely brilliant in sort of highlighting a number of these. There's a lot of ways in which our legal system in the US does not reflect human dignity, and in fact does real violence to it and real damage to it in ways that Barrett's been talking about. I tend to think that if we pay more attention just as a social matter, but then as lawyers, if we pay more attention in the legal claims that we bring, judges pay more attention to how laws are actually affecting people, then we can move our legal system closer to justice by having it reflect the values of human dignity. One of the things we see in the cases, to some extent in the US, but much more developed in other parts of the world, is that judges are not only paying attention to dignity in the results that they're reaching, they're finding governments, and I look mostly at constitutional cases, but you can see this also in torts areas and in other places, they're finding governments liable for violating people's human dignities. They're ordering governments to change their policies in order to respect human dignity. And that can be in ways relating to voting rights, ways relating to climate change, ways relating to housing and medical care and education and all kinds of other things, LGBT rights, all kinds of areas where courts are actually doing that. And there's no reason that our courts couldn't be more attuned to that.
Erin, could you give the audience sort of one concrete example where there's been a remedy like that issued to a government?
Yeah, I'll give you one example just because I think it's such a great case because it gets to something that law doesn't otherwise get to. But there's a constitutional court in Latin America that was hearing a case in which people who are unusually short, much shorter than average, were going up to the windows in post offices and other government buildings where you walk up to a teller or something. And if you're particularly short or in a wheelchair, you might meet the government official who's on the other side of that, like this, right? And that might make you feel less important than them if you have to look up to them, if you're not fully seen as the whole person that you are. And this isn't a basis of discrimination on which they could otherwise sue. And yet the court recognized not just the discriminatory impact, but really the violation of dignity in having some people meet the government officials sort of at eye level and other people not being able to. So that's just a very simple example. There are much more significant, sort of broadly significant cases, as I say, about climate change, about voting rights, about all these other things where courts have been not at all shy in recognizing the dignity implications. Many courts around the world have recognized same-sex marriage and same-sex relations on the basis of dignity. Many courts around the world have invalidated the death penalty and life without parole on the basis of dignity. So those are some other examples.
Okay, and Barrett.
Yeah, so I guess, one thing I find really interesting about the US, and I think this is a byproduct of just an ethnocidal foundation, is that we think that like words in many ways are just empty and that philosophy is not a thing that we need. And so like if I'm going to interact with someone, say I'm a person who's going to implement ethnocide, if I say what I'm going to do to the other, they clearly won't interact with me. So like obfuscation and like not following through with what you say just becomes like a norm where you have conversations and those conversations might make you feel good, but there's not a cultural expectation that someone feels that they have the agency to do something because the words that they're hearing or the words that they say actually matter and should like create actions afterwards. And so I think that's just, I get this all the time. I find it very intriguing, but like things matter because people recognize the agency, their own dignity, and then they act on it. And so the goal here is if we can provide you with a philosophical perspective on how to see yourself and see other people, and then some language that allows you to articulate this perspective when you casually talk to regular everyday people. And then if you're a lawyer, like another tier of language that can then help you cultivate laws and have discussions about making society better, well then, yes, you should be able to have a whole array of actions every single day. And that should be just the understood expectation where we're not just gathering to have like trivial conversations that sound like lofty, where we can feel as though we're smart as we just celebrate being trivial. So everything we're saying right here, it's, language is powerful. The philosophy, the way you see the world is powerful, and that can guide you to make consistent change in the world. Because if I say the same thing consistently with the philosophical foundation about a vision of making the world a better place, then just my everyday actions will be a manifestation of that. And, I would say, case in point, I hang out with all these lawyers and judges, and I do not have a law degree at all. I'm a philosopher, but the consistency of me being able to articulate my philosophy allows me to have conversations in spaces that I'm not necessarily as much of an expert as other people. And then that change can happen. So no, this is just not a conversation to make us feel like we're doing something. It's, you get a philosophy, you get language, go out into the world and use your mind and your words to make things happen.
Well, you all have certainly been influential this afternoon, and I'm going to give you an opportunity for a closing comment, but I want to share with you a couple of things that people have written recently. One person says, transforming the frames we see through is critical. Our biases and ignorance of the way in which a white supremacy normative is steeped in our constitutional jurisprudence and rights/dignity analysis is also at issue. Someone else writes, in order to clean our individual lens, so to speak, we definitely need to see the same issues through the lens of others. And another person said that they're going to change the way they look at and approach the resolution of homelessness issues. And so I think you are having the desired effect, and that is we're thinking more expansively. We're trying to be inclusive in addressing these issues and recognizing that many of these issues will require thinking outside of our normal frames, collaborating with others, bringing in the perspectives of others, and then challenging those policymakers and people who are, as Barrett mentioned, whose job it is to address some of these issues, to really do their job from a perspective of inclusion and from a perspective of dignity. So having said that, before I make my last remarks, I'm going to give each of you 90 seconds for your close and any takeaways that you want to give the group or answers that you want to give to questions that I didn't get around to asking you. And I'll start with you, Erin.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for these fantastic and really thought-provoking questions. I would love to continue the conversation if people would like. I think all I'll mention now is one of my favorite books about law is called Law's Relations. It's by Jennifer Nadelsky. And what she does is she really posits that all of law is really just about relationships, right? It's the way we regulate relationships. And at the core of all of this work that we've been talking about is the idea that our relationship should be defined by the most fundamental fact of the human experience, which is that everybody has inherent, inalienable, and equal worth. So I would just use that as sort of the touchstone. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Barrett. Your closing comments and any takeaways you want people to have.
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is to learn more about ethnocide, please purchase my book, The Crime Without a Name, Ethnocide and the Erasure of Culture in America. NPR picked it as one of their top books of 2021, so that's pretty cool. I have an organization called the Sustainable Culture Lab. So if you can please go to our website, scl.community, if you want to donate or support. And I have a newsletter called The Word with Barrett, Holmes, Pitner, and it's on Substack. And so please subscribe to that. And and I'll drop links to those places in the chat. Thanks.
Great. And I want to just say what an honor it has been for me to be a part of this conversation. You two, Barrett and Erin, are amazing, amazing human beings. You are giants in your field. And I want to again mention the name of Barrett's award-winning book, The Crime Without a Name, Ethnocide and the Erasure of Culture in America. There it is. And I also want to mention, for people who've been on this call who wanted to know more, there's a book called Advanced Introduction to Human Dignity in Law that is authored by Professors James May and Erin Daly. They also have a case book on dignity law. And I would highly recommend that you get these books. And I also want to mention the Center for Human Rights does amazing work domestically and internationally. We welcome your support and your involvement in the projects and programs of the Center for Human Rights, one of which is the Dignity Rights Project, and also the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. They have been on the vanguard of civil rights and social justice issues, including voting and all of these other issues we've talked about. They are known, that section rather is known as the conscience of the American Bar Association. But if you are not a member, I would encourage you to join. The membership fee is nominal. But there's so much work to do, and we certainly need hands to do that. We would welcome your involvement in the section for civil rights and social justice. You have a number of links in the chat. Please feel free to copy those and to access them. I want to thank the executive director, the staff director of the Center for Human Rights, Michael Pates, for the yeoman's work that he does and for all that he is involved in to keep us going and steadily moving forward. And to Ali Kilgard, who is the staff director or project manager for the section for civil rights and social justice. If you need anything more about either of these organizations, those individuals can provide them. And with that, I want to say to each of you, Thank you for being with us, and let us embrace dignity in all that we do. Let us really look and explore more to see how this is integrated and manifested in the substantive and procedural law that we study each and every day. There are other dimensions. So thank you so much. Barrett, thank you for what you do. Thank you for being the Philosopher-In-Chief. And everybody go to the Sustainable Lab Project and check it out.